Welcome to today's webinar, Transforming the Enterprise, Thoughts on Changing the Business Delivery Process with BIM, presented by Dominic Fasser-Arthur of Autodesk. Please submit all questions to the chat panel at the lower left of your screen. Dominic may choose to answer relevant questions as they come in, but may defer them until the end of the presentation. If you are seeking continuing education credits, please complete the webinar attendance form at www.cmaanet.org/webinar-attendance within 48 hours of completing this webinar. I will now turn the webinar over to Dominic.
Good afternoon, and thank you for taking the time to join me today for this webinar on the topic of transforming the enterprise. My name is Dominic Fasser-Arthur, and I'm Autodesk's thought leader for the global construction industry. Here at Autodesk, I guide our long-term vision for construction by identifying the challenges and trends we see in your sector, looking out over the 3 to 10 year time frame. Before I begin, some housekeeping. I'll reiterate once again, should you have any questions during the course of this session, please do feel free to enter them into the system, and I'll happily take a selection of them at the end. I'll also share some details of where you can find further information on this topic and on our construction-related products and services before I close. So, transforming the enterprise. Is there a bigger challenge for any business, for your business? Business transformation, I guess, is one of those phrases, much like strategy and many others, that seems to have entered the common currency of business speak over the last few years. It means different things to different people, but in the context of this session, we'll be returning it to its roots. Business transformation for us is going to be about changing what you do as a company, or the way you do it, in such a fundamental, all-encompassing manner that there isn't a single aspect of your organization that isn't touched by it. Over the last few years, as BIM has become more entrenched in the fabric of the construction industry, it's probably fair to say the majority of focus has been on its role as a tool to, I guess, support efficient, productive delivery of capital projects, for improving and automating work processes. And that capability has, rightly so, been a major, a primary driver in leading to a fantastic adoption rate and the general uptake across the contracting community. But moving beyond the project, what has the impact been of BIM on construction enterprises? On their balance sheets, their operating margins, brand performance, or any of those other big-ticket KPIs that measure business success, the whole reason why you're in business at the end of the day. We know BIM has worked wonders for projects, but we also know that some companies have sometimes struggled with scaling up those individual wins to reap those benefits consistently and repeatably across their entire portfolio of operations, and embed that capability in their enterprises without incurring escalating costs or major disruption. Can the same approach to implementation you used when you first brought BIM into your organization enable you to achieve those higher level, real business focused, very KPI enterprise level goals? Today in this session, over the balance of the next 40 minutes or so, I'm going to share some thoughts, some observations and some concepts on the intersection between BIM as an example of an enterprise level technology enabled process, long phrase I realize, but that's what BIM is, and the discipline of business transformation. We'll get back to basics on what BIM can do for a construction enterprise, and we'll draw on lessons learned from other sectors of the economy who've been through similar major transformational changes, and look at the key steps of building and delivering a successful transformation program. So our route today will begin by taking a look at changing the perception of BIM, moving beyond its role as a project improvement tool and towards that of an enterprise tool. Something we're starting to see certain companies, and I'm reticent to use the phrase leading, but certain companies in the contracting community are adopting as a stance to help them really maximize the business benefits of BIM. We're then going to look at that phrase transformation. What is it? How does it work? And why should you care? Then we're going to go through the 3 key stages of defining, delivering, and moving beyond a BIM-based business transformation program. We'll start by having you pose the question to yourselves, where do you want BIM to take you as a company? Think big. Remember, you're thinking here about changing your company. Then we'll get under the hood of the mechanics of a transformation program, and we'll look at what happens after you close a program. There's more to it than filing things away in a dusty archive box, as we're all used to doing on construction projects. And finally, I'll summarize and we'll have some time for questions at the end. A quick note, as you embark on the process, if you're considering a major transformational program and changing your business, it's worth noting that you're not alone. This session is, of course, just an introduction, a very light overview, but hopefully it should help you generate more questions and answers and start looking around at some of the excellent resources that are out there. Practically every other sector of the economy, perhaps with the exception of agriculture, has been through major technology, information technology led disruption or transformational change. And there's lots of learning and lots of benefits and lots of methodologies that you can tap into from those sectors that are very transferable and very relevant to construction. So if we put down the hard hat and put our business hats on, when we consider the business of construction, it can be a pretty difficult industry to earn a living in. If you strip everything back to basics, as a projects-based industry, ultimately, construction's challenge boils down to three core KPIs. Predictability of cost and schedule, productivity, how efficiently you use men, machine, materials, money, and any other key resources, and profitability, ultimately, why you do this. If you look at those statistics from the Department of Commerce or other sources, you'll no doubt be aware that the industry's performance for those three KPIs has lagged behind many other sectors. For example, between 1987 and 2010, productivity in US construction declined at a compound annual growth rate of -0.45%. Each year productivity got worse by 0.54%. But at the same time, productivity in non-farm sectors increased by a compound annual growth rate of 0.92%. Similarly, over the last 10 years, predictability in construction projects has fluctuated around 49% for cost and 43% for schedule. That means 49% of projects came in at or under budget, and 43% of projects came in on or ahead of target completion date. And finally, average margins for contracting operations have bounced around the 2 to 3% level for the last 25 years. Currently, right now, given the fragile economic conditions, I wouldn't be surprised if they're significantly lower than that. None of this is unknown to anybody who's involved in construction, but if you look at the reasons why the industry has this challenge, yes, they're many and varied. Disjointed contracting structures, problems with antagonistic supply chains, late design changes, etc. We're all aware of these, but if you strip those all back to the basics, then actually all those problems are either cause or are caused by poor information management. People didn't have accurate, complete and timely information to do their job right time, right first time, every time. And along has come this thing called BIM. And BIM has made this pledge to you as construction professionals. Amongst other things, it's pledged to help you out by imposing order on the information chaos, as it were, that exists on many projects. In basic terms, it commits to uphold accurate, complete and timely information, and in so doing, unlocks those benefits of greater productivity, greater predictability, and ultimately greater reward, more money, greater profit for your efforts. And BIM helps you deliver business better, faster, cheaper, smarter, many other dimensions. I'm sure most of you are, if not all of you, are already receiving these benefits, certainly at the project level through using BIM. But that promise that BIM makes is a very democratic promise. It applies equally to all of you. So while you're sitting here listening to this call thinking, yes, that's me, that's the benefit that I'm receiving, everybody else on this call is also thinking the same thing. And that's leading to that interesting situation that we're starting to see now as more and more contractors become BIM-enabled and start competing with this very much value message of efficient, productive delivery of projects. When clients come knocking, it becomes increasingly difficult for them to be able to distinguish between any two contractors. And those of you that attend the various trade fairs and the annual conferences of organizations such as CMAA and their peers will know that increasingly as BIM heads towards, and in some cases tips over, 50% adoption rate in a given market, but customers are finding it increasingly difficult to distinguish between any two. And this is an example, if you like, a very simplified account of what we're starting to see is happening in the market. Whereas traditionally, a contractor may have been able to distinguish themselves by the fact that they'd use BIM alone, by saying, I can reduce the total installed cost of your project, Mr. Customer, by perhaps 3% based on industry average. Now more and more companies are starting to say that, and it becomes very difficult for any one company to distinguish themselves for the use of BIM based on that promise that BIM has made to you. The rate of adoption that we know is changing the BIM proposition. So this whole issue around predictability and productivity. And it's forcing many in the industry to change the stance of how they implement it and why they're implementing it and how they manage it going forwards. And this is the standard technology adoption curve. And what I've done on this in this blue hashed area is give an indication, an approximation of perhaps where BIM is. And this is my view, and this is very much a North Atlantic view, so it's a blend of what I am seeing is going on in North America and Northwest Europe combined. But I'd encourage everybody to go away and have a think about where they think adoption is in terms of the rate of saturation of use of BIM within their specific markets and within their specific sectors that they're competing in. Why is that important when it comes to how you implement BIM going forwards? Well, obviously the key thing here is that as the market heads towards a saturation point where the majority of people, majority of companies are using BIM, the opportunity to gain an advantage, the opportunity to stand out from the crowd when you're competing for work, when you're responding to tenders, by saying I use BIM and it helps me to improve my productivity and my predictability, diminishes over time. And by the time 51% or more of the market is doing the same thing, there is no longer an advantage by you doing exactly the same thing that they are. Part of my job involves digesting a lot of reports around adoption rates globally and how BIM is being taken up by the industry across all sectors. And one of the most recent reports I read had some interesting statistics in it. Probably the key one was that 84% of contractors who responded to the report believed that their use of BIM was giving them a competitive advantage. But if you actually dug down through the report and understood what it was that they were using BIM for, they were all doing pretty similar things. So clash detection, some 4D, some 5D, perhaps a bit of 6 or 7D, but essentially they're pretty much using it for the same thing. The interesting paradox there, how the majority can claim to have a competitive advantage if the majority are doing what the majority are doing. So what we're starting to see today is the question is no longer just about project efficiency. The question is moving forwards and sort of asking this question of how can BIM now help us gain sustained competitive advantage beyond the temporary first mover, early adopter advantage perhaps we've managed to gain by stepping into the market early on before the majority of the industry has. How can BIM help us provide a source of differentiation? But things have moved forward further still, and we're starting to see companies question the use of BIM and how it can start to address some more of the more complex enterprise challenges that contractors face. And we're starting to see the emergence of this paradigm of BIM is the answer, what's the question? How can it help us better manage finances? How can it improve our agility, improve our corporate social responsibility, offer new services, better enable us to handle risk, etc., etc. So BIM is emerging from a rather technical proposition around project performance improvement, which is where it started out, and it's certainly becoming positioned far closer to the enterprise. So a question for you to think about is, do you think the way that you implement BIM and manage it going forwards can remain the same as when you implemented BIM initially, when it first came into your organizations? Do you think that's the most appropriate way to manage BIM to respond to these sort of challenges in a highly competitive market and with a lot of pressure to be able to respond to enterprise type issues? So this phrase business transformation, and specifically technology-enabled business transformation, is one that kind of came out in the 1990s, reached a bit of a peak then. And I guess it came out on the back of the big ERP transformation programs that became the bread and butter for many in the industry back then. And what I'd like to do is to spend a few minutes now talking about why a business transformational approach to managing BIM can potentially give you a much better result than the standard traditional way that many companies in the construction industry have implemented BIM when they first brought it into their organization. Because business transformation as a discipline has been around for a few years now, it's reached a bit of a level of maturity that enables us to a certain degree to be reasonably confident about predicting the outcome on a company when a major new process like BIM is implemented, based upon how that company chooses to implement BIM across their company. And we know that if you look at this adoption graph, the one I showed earlier, it's equally applicable within a company in terms of how BIM or how a major process can be implemented and achieve saturated usage throughout a company. We know that typically a process like BIM enters in this experimental-led phase. If you think back, cast your minds back to when you first implemented BIM, how did it enter your organization? In many cases it comes in on the back of 1, 2, 3, perhaps half a dozen different projects. Somebody will get behind it, somebody will sponsor it, somebody will throw some money in, and somebody will say, yes, we'll take the risk, we'll give this a go. And that's not untypical for any major process. But to get mass adoption, we know takes a very different way of managing BIM. It can't be done in a skunkworks fashion. It can't be done in a piecemeal, in a very bespoke fashion. It needs to very much be led at an enterprise level. And what we're starting to see is something that's been very common in many other sectors of the economy as they struggle with similar major disruptive technology challenges in how they implement and how they achieve that transition to a new state of business through the use of technology. We're starting to see, and many of you may be very familiar with this, companies hitting the gap of how they make that transition from having brought BIM in and it being used on multiple projects in perhaps a very bespoke way to the saturated use of BIM in a business as usual way. And the gap, or the chasm as it's often known, how a company chooses and positions to transition itself across that chasm is very influential on what success will look like for that company going forwards. What was good to start with isn't necessarily good to finish with in terms of implementation. And this gap represents a critical decision point for companies. So any of you that are either at this gap or trying to forge it, it's a great time to sit down with your executive and have this kind of conversation with you about them being aware of the decisions they need to make in terms of choosing how they cross this chasm, how they move forwards to achieve saturated use of BIM across your organization will be very influential in success for the organization going forwards. If we look at the idealized way that a business transformation program works, and we say that a company has followed this to the letter, as it were, we know that we can predict the impact that it will have on a business. Yes, initially you'll take a bit of a business hit, so you'll have a negative impact as you roll out, as you invest, as you go through the organizational disruption, as you adjust and align to this new way of working. But then you'll quickly accelerate up this curve of unlocking those efficiency, productivity, and other benefits across your enterprise, and you'll end up at a new plateau, a new higher level of business performance. And there are some key characteristics to that level. We know that typically you will have a lot of consistency across your work processes. You'll have a repeatability of usage. So all projects will have the same repeatability, you'll have the same known costs for the use of BIM, you'll have the same known impact, you'll have good information management, you'll have a very controlled environment, and your usage of BIM will be a business as usual environment. So you'll have moved to a new consistent way of working. Exactly the same way that you had before you used BIM, but you've now introduced this and you've successfully moved across there. If you use this approach, this transformational approach, the things that executives love is the cost profile associated with it. It takes a CapEx for investment to get you up and running, to bring the process of BIM into your organization, to transform your organization. But if you've done it successfully through a transformational approach, BIM will then be shifted to being an OpEx, a known steady state OpEx, where you will pay for it in exactly the same way you will for any other project cost. And any innovation will be done in a very controlled, in an incremental cost, incremental minor CapEx manner. So here's what we know typically happens for companies that try to implement major technology-enabled change, like BIM, but don't adopt a transformational program approach. Now, this is obviously a worst-case example here, but potentially you end up with a poorer business performance than you had before you even contemplated implementing or pushing forwards with BIM. And you end up potentially with a lot of variation in your work processes, so a high degree of work process proliferation. Bespoke delivery, so BIM is used slightly differently on every project, and there's a capital expenditure and there are risks associated with doing that. Whilst you're solving some of the information challenges, you're also encountering others because there isn't consistency across projects. And you tend to find companies that forge ahead and that don't necessarily adopt that transformational approach end up with a lot of uncontrolled innovation, and that adds dollars. It adds dollars to your costs, and that ends up with you making less money and taking greater risk at the end of the day. And all in all, it represents your enterprise, perhaps not your individual project, but your enterprise overall with a greater degree of uncertainty, because you're not necessarily aligned across your estate of projects with where your enterprise is going. So if each project is doing its own thing, whilst that might be good for the needs of the individual project, is that necessarily good for you as an enterprise? And again, the graph that tends to scare CFOs, finance directors, is this issue of, well, if you don't necessarily follow a transformational approach, you run the risk of accelerating CapEx. And this is a key reason that CFOs and FDs tend to get on board with the whole business transformation approach. It's because they look at this graph and it scares the heck out of them. So it's a great motivational graph for getting commitment if you're looking at doing such a program. So drawing on the transformation disciplines and its relative maturity, we can see that of the two ways of forging ahead with BIM, perhaps you've used it to a certain extent and you're now looking to take it to that next level of responding to your enterprise challenges. The experimental-led way represents a certain degree or a higher degree of risk with perhaps a less favourable outcome. But the transformational-led approach, based on what we've seen and we know happens in other sectors with similar challenges, is going to lower the risk and likely give you a better outcome. So if we now look at, well, what's involved if you want to go down this route of a transformational approach to bringing BIM in and changing your business? The first key step is what I'll call beginning at the end. Where do you want BIM to take you? At the end of the day, this is a business question. It's not a technology, it's not a process, and it's not a project question. And what we're finding is there are three critical elements that are forming the basis for an answer to that question. But again, some companies, an increasing number of companies, are beginning to gravitate towards. The first is this question around competitive advantage, and that's coming very much to the forefront now, especially given today's market and the poor economic conditions that we continually seem to be in this past few years. If you look at the left-hand side of this diagram, this notion of competitive advantage, forget about BIM for a second. Ask yourself the question, what is it that distinguishes you in the market today, that helps you win work? It is the reason why a customer signs with you and not with your competitors. This is an example here that represents half a dozen different dimensions of competitive advantage. These may be the same as yours, you may have others, but I'd encourage you perhaps to go away and think about the last half a dozen successful bids you had and categorize what it was that enabled you to stand out from the crowd. Was it the price that you submitted at? Was it your ability to rapidly change markets and perhaps grab a piece of work that you didn't traditionally go after? Was it the power of the unique knowledge that you had? Is it your embedded efficiency, etc.? Think about that and then think about overlaying BIM on top of those dimensions and say, what can BIM possibly do to help enhance those dimensions, to make me more competitive, to give me more of an advantage in the market? And then equally, how do you measure that? Coming back to some of my opening remarks, how many of you today can put your hands up and say, I can say in dollars and cents what the impact of my use of BIM is on my company's margin, on my company's revenue targets, etc. Don't sell yourself short. You've all been doing fantastic work with BIM, which has had great impacts on the projects you've been using. It's not too much of a major exercise to then look at rolling that up across projects and translating that to the balance sheet issues that your executives, that your C-suite face. So the first critical element there is around BIM and competitive advantage, and how do you want BIM to differentiate you in the market? The second critical element is potentially quite an abstract one, but it's about how BIM can be used to manage the four soft commodities that exist in your company and your projects: data, information, knowledge, wisdom. It's a slightly esoteric notion, but if you think about it, the focus, certainly in the last few years and probably still largely now, with BIM has been around information management. So very much the left-hand side of this diagram. How can we ensure that BIM is helping us to have accurate, complete and timely information? But here's a business truism for you. A company that focuses on the left-hand side of this diagram, that obsesses almost around having ultra-efficient information management, is competing for the efficiency prize, and essentially is pushing themselves into price point competition, because it's getting far easier for a company to copy another company to use automation to improve efficiency. But a company that's focused on the right-hand side of this diagram is very much focused on adding value, and potentially is competing in a value proposition mode, and there's far more opportunity to gain competitive advantage for doing that. So the key here is thinking about how can BIM help you minimize what you need to do on the left of this diagram and maximize opportunities around knowledge and wisdom, and bringing those to bear to help you be more competitive and offer you more as a company when you're competing and delivering work. And the third critical element that we're finding some companies are gravitating towards is this notion of BIM in the three dimensions of business. Optimized delivery, ensuring that you are most efficient and most successful at delivering work. Business alignment, ensuring that you are aligning your BIM strategy 100% with your enterprise strategy. The two are connected and measurably connected. And then construction intelligence, this notion of business intelligence. How can BIM help you to get to make better decisions, to read the market better, to read your customers better, and to be in a position of discovering new knowledge, of discovering things perhaps you didn't know, to help you improve your operations. And for each of these, you'll notice here I've put an advantage rating in the top right-hand corner in terms of how powerful they are, in terms of the ability they have to affect your position in the market. And that's something you might want to consider when you're building your transformation program and determining what it is you want to get out of BIM as an endpoint. So optimized delivery, achieving saturated, optimized delivery of BIM across your enterprise. What does that look like? Well, yes, it means you're doing a lot of BIM. BIM is your normal way of operating for delivering projects, but you're doing it in a commoditized manner. You've got standard templates based on a dozen or so different types of contracts that you compete for. A known input, you know what it's going to cost in terms of people, process, technology and money. And significantly, as I mentioned earlier, you've moved from BIM being a CapEx on projects to just being an OpEx, a standard run rate that's recoverable in exactly the same way as paying for the lights or paying the phone bill on any other project service. Business alignment is this key, very overrated, overused phrase that's very important when it comes to thinking about how you're going to leverage BIM in an enterprise capacity. And it really is about saying, what can this stuff start to do for me? What do I want BIM to do for me at the highest level of my organization? And this falls into these two buckets of how can it help me be more agile? How can I respond to a changing market? Can I offer new services like carbon modeling or energy modeling or whole life cost modeling, whatever it might be? Can I move into new non-traditional markets more easily, leveraging BIM? Increase my global reach. There's a lot of talk around the cloud now. Can I perhaps connect dynamically with new partners or new customers through BIM? And then equally the second bucket of what can this do for the kind of processes that really my C-suite are interested in. My cash flow, margin, revenue growth. Can it help me lower my risk profile for my insurance premiums, etc. And then finally this notion of applying business intelligence to the construction world and leveraging the whole issues of what can I start to do with all of this lovely structured information that BIM is accruing. How can I help How can I use it to help me gain an advantage, discover something I didn't know, improve a process, do all of that great stuff that perhaps many of your companies are already doing purely in the financial realm through using things like business intelligence. So this is a great one to go knocking on the door of your CFO or your finance director to talk to them about. So by addressing those critical elements, those three and perhaps more, those which are specific to your organization and your company's top-level enterprise strategy, you should be able to produce a definition with tangible goals of what you want BIM to do for you as a company, not as a project. So now if we think about once you've defined that, how do you move forwards? What does that look like? So the real guts of the transformation program. Well, a bit of Surgeon General's warning here to kick us off. The main reason you may have heard why transformation programs often fail or get into hot water is because they don't practice something that's very basic that you all do in construction that seems to get lost in business transformation programs. And it's this very simple circular question of asking every day, every week, starting at the top left-hand corner, where are we? Where do we need to be in terms of moving our company? How are we going to get there? And are we there yet? This one in the bottom left, are we there yet, is the one that tends to trip up many companies because of scope creep. Perhaps you brought BIM in, but you've now decided to do something else with it, and the goalposts have moved. And they keep moving, and often you get disconnected from the rationale of what it is that you're trying to achieve that you've defined in the previous section. So with that in mind, how do you take that initial definition, that here's what I want BIM to do for me, and use that to start to feed and to build a program? Well, here's an approach. This is a 5-step approach. You may have seen others. There are those that are out there. Some of your companies may well be using your own proprietary approach. But essentially, they're all a variation on a theme. And it starts with taking your requirements, the start box there, and feeding those in to your business goals. As a business, parking BIM separately, where do you need to get to? And how does what you're trying to do with BIM relate to that? Then how are you going to enable that? If you're looking, for example, to grow your business by 10% year on year, and you're looking for BIM to be a flagship to help you to win work in doing that, what do you need to put in place? What kind of things do you need to do? Is it marketing? Is it process re-engineering? What is it that you need to do as an enabler to achieve that? Once you determine that, you need to quantify that. How much marketing? Which processes and to what degree do you need to re-engineer? And then to analyze that. Okay, if this is what I need to do, what's it going to take to achieve that in dollars and cents? What is the risk to my business in doing that? What are the various outcomes that are available? What are the different options I have for achieving that? Now this is a circular diagram because you may find that you'll go around this circle 2, 3, perhaps even half a dozen different times until you land on a set of options that really align, have a great congruence with your organization's appetite for risk, its appetite for change, its appetite for spending, and the other dimensions that really characterize the culture of your organization. And what should fall out of that is your high-level transformation program. And what you're going to do with that is then use that to seed delivering the transformation. And here is an example of a 7-step process for implementing a transformation program. The key is the phrase I've put at the bottom right here. A program only needs to be as complex as you need it to be. There are many different methodologies that I mentioned earlier, different sectors of trials, etc. There's some great learning that's out there that you can leverage. For me, these are the 7 key steps when I've delivered transformation programs that I've found have been successful. The first thing to do is to take that output that you've got from the previous slide and pause. Don't rush in straight away and implement. Pause, put it on the back burner, take a little while, and then come back and move into this first stage, the stage of 7 gated stages, and it's the validation stage. Ask yourself those questions. Why are we doing this? What are we looking to gain? How are we going to do it? And where does this fit into our company in terms of everything else we've got going on? Is now the right time to push the button? If it is, and you move through that stage, then you'll initiate the whole turning the key in the ignition. Securing sponsorship. And sponsorship here, I mean, is building those relationships and ownership at the highest level in your company. The person that ultimately cuts the checks, getting them on board, getting them bought in as the sponsor for this major program, so that it has the gravitas behind it. Building that high-level, top-level program, so in an analogy in construction, this is the equivalent to your strategic program. Assembling the program team, and I'll touch on that in the slide that's afterwards. And really then energizing your whole organization, getting everybody from the receptionist to the CFO energized and excited about this major change that you are going to deliver. Once you've done that, you move through to the next stage, creating the new organization. This isn't implementing it, this is creating that solution. Trialing and building those new processes and all of the supporting infrastructure that take both the technology, the people, the cultural change, things that you'll need to do for that to be successful. And the key here is securing those links to those KPIs that you delivered, that you selected right back when you said, here's what I want BIM to do for me. When you've achieved that and you've prototyped that and you're clear that you've got, here is the end state that I'm looking to move my organization to, that's when you move into the rollout. And that's then the key classic stuff of segmenting the organization, working out how you're going to implement it, who the different constituencies are, taking a snapshot of where you are today so that you'll know you'll be able to measure that you've been successful after you've done it, and then doing your production planning and implementing that production plan of going ahead and rolling it out and moving your organization from the previous way of doing business to the new way with BIM at its heart, and then confirming that you've got there. Confirming that you've hit those improvements in KPIs or changes that you were seeking to make. But that's not the end. There are two critical stages that come after this. The first one here I've labeled process. This is about just ensuring that the processes that you've got are correct. Now they're being used in anger across your organization. Do you need to tweak them? Do you need to bottleneck them? Go back, revisit them, continually monitor them. And this thing that I've called enterprise. Just confirming that what you've done is scalable. By scalable, I don't necessarily mean if we win more work, will it break? I mean, if you perhaps change direction as you respond to market changes. If your market is drying up in one area and you have to go after work in another area, will BIM and the transformation you've made be flexible enough and robust enough to stand that, or will it break? What might you need to do to change that? And then finally, a key one which many people forget is celebrate. What you've done is a major thing. You have changed the way that your company works. Don't forget to celebrate that and then prepare for the next stage. So a quick word in terms of the supporting cast of characters that you'll need to pull this off. Whenever I've delivered programs, whenever I've managed these kind of transformational programs, I find there are a minimum of 5 roles that need to exist. These don't have to be a cast of thousands. They don't necessarily have to be large groups, but they do really need to be 5 distinct roles. Starting at the top left is the program office. That's the classic stuff that you guys are all familiar with in construction. These are the doers, the people that are going to design and implement the program. Then the program board, the people who are going to hold the doers to account. So the PMC, if you like, if you're the construction firm. So typically that will be formed from a number of executives and other parties that are going to hold you to account. So the equivalent of the operational board in a company. Then the technology board, who would typically be headed up by the CIO or one of his direct reports, just to ensure that the technology component of what you're doing fits in with the overall technology strategy in the same way that the business aspect of what you're doing fits in with the company's business strategy. And that keys into this business rationale forum. So if the program board is the equivalent of your company's operational board, the business rationale forum is representation from your business strategists. So these are the people who are saying, yeah, absolutely, our company is going to head in this direction over the next 5 years. What you're proposing in this transformation aligns with that very clearly. And then finally, this notion of work process owners. Each and every work process, depending on how granular you get, must have an owner. And that owner must have a seat at the table in terms of a voice of, here is what I need to happen as you change my process, or here is how my process is not performing, or here is how my process is overperforming. And the key to all of this is that the program office is the group that not only assembles and delivers the program, but marshals these various group of individuals to ensure that everybody's on the same page and runs around and does that coordination role. So if you've done all this successfully, you will, hopefully touch wood, move from BIM as a tool that you use on multiple projects, perhaps in slightly different ways, to BIM embedded within the heart of your organization and delivering major enterprise benefits. So what happens after you've done that? Do you kick back and go fishing in Australia, as many of us dream? No, there's a key stage that happens after a program is finished. So universal truths. Universal truth number one is the business world never stands still. Typical transformation program for a medium to large size enterprise can take anywhere from 12 to 36 months. And in that time, going back from when you originally set those goals, the world has moved on. As I mentioned earlier, everybody on this call is no doubt representative from a different commercial entity. And everybody's thinking in terms of how BIM can help them solve their challenges. So your competitors are continually looking to innovate and discover in exactly the same way that you are. Universal truth number two is that trends never stand still. These are a selection of the trends that we are seeing here at Autodesk when we look out into the world and say, on the right-hand side, what is it that's shaping technology going forwards? And on the left-hand side, what is it that we think is going to influence the construction industry going forwards? It's worth sitting down after you've finished your program and doing an assessment and saying, if the world has moved on, are our initial assumptions that we made 1, 2, 3 years ago still valid? Or has the world changed so significantly that it's time to build a new program to take us to another level? And universal truth number three is that once the program ends, it ends in time for a new one to begin. And it's really important here that I make it clear, I'm not talking here about scope creep and continuous improvement. I'm talking very much about stepped evolution. So once you've completed your program, it's really key to retain those program capabilities as a core discipline in exactly the same way that engineering and project controls and finance are within your organization, if you haven't done already. Set up an innovation center to be able to chew up these big issues of what happens with technology, what's happening in a changing world. It doesn't need to be a big organization, and ideally it shouldn't be a big organization, but it should be very focused and have the freedom to ask those big questions and have the backing at the highest level of your company. Set up an enterprise antenna. It's a hackneyed phrase, but it's around something that's going to enable you to look out into the world and detect, as I showed on the previous slide, what are the things that are happening out there? And how can I process those as incoming opportunities? Is, for example, the cloud, is, for example, 3D printing or digital reality, are these things that I need to be concerned about as a construction company, as my company? Are they going to impact me going forwards? How do I quantify, qualify, pass them through some kind of gated mechanism that says, yes, this is something I now need to start thinking about building a program around? Once you've done that, be ready to move decisively because you still retain those program capabilities. And a key question I'm asked as I bump around the world talking about transformational programs is, how often should we leap? How often should we, what is healthy in terms of bringing in transformation programs? And it's a tough question, but I'd reflect on, for example, many of you may have heard of Moore's Law in terms of computing power, I think doubles every, you have to excuse me, I believe it's every 18 months or so. Well, equally, technology leaps tend to happen every 3 years. So if, for example, you're in a 3-year program or even an 18-month program, you're ideally suited to be able to finish and take advantage of the fact that the world has moved on. It's really key not to have a staccato management of change programs, so not to be continually reacting to the market, but also not to leave it too long before something happens. So to be able to judge those gaps that you need to have between running programs and to avoid scope creep and to really focus on stepped evolution as opposed to one continual thing. So to sum up, transforming the enterprise with BIM, so a few things to consider. We've covered quite a lot of ground here. BIM is a transformational phenomenon. It has definitely moved out of that stable of being a tool to help improve efficiency and productivity. Yes, it offers efficiency opportunities, but it is starting to offer and potentially has unlimited potential for enterprise opportunities. If you're going to get the most out of it, it needs executive ownership. It must be owned by the CEO or one of his direct reports. And a transformational program approach to really embedding BIM in your organization is going to give you a far better, lower risk outcome than forging ahead perhaps with an experimental approach. There's one key takeaway I'd say everyone shouldn't forget is do link BIM, your usage of BIM, to your core KPIs wherever you can. It can be a very persuasive argument for you in fighting those battles with executives of funding. If you're able to say, well, our use of BIM as a company has helped to add so many $100,000 to our bottom line, or has helped to protect our margins by so much, or reduce our insurance premiums, and whatever it might be. Programs aren't complex, they're as complex as you need to make them. The key to success is communication and getting enough people on board. And finally, there is plenty of help out there. I'd encourage everybody to take a look if you haven't done already, and I'm sure many of you may well be practicing these kind of programs, and look at what other sectors have done, particularly big ERP implementations, big MRP implementations, big automation implementations, because they have spent lots of blood, sweat, tear, and money on learning how to do this and how to do this well. And the final thought is, obviously, don't become complacent. If you're using a lot of BIM and you're using it successfully on individual projects, don't think that your competitors aren't as well. So thank you for listening. We've covered a lot of ground here. As I mentioned earlier, here are some key sites that you can go to on our corporate website to pick up further information on this. If you'd like, if you have specific questions outside of this or need specific information, please do contact us directly at Autodesk or your sales representative or your channel partner. But at this stage, I'll probably hand back to our host and happy to take a selection of questions. Thank you.
All right, excellent. I believe Scott is still on the line. Scott is an associate of Dominic's, and he's going to help guide us through the Q&A question before we get finished up. So if anybody does have questions, feel free to go ahead and start typing those in that chat panel. We'll give you guys a minute to get some of those in, and then we'll answer a selection of the best ones.
Thanks, Joe. Hi, everyone. This is Scott Barrett. I'm a colleague of Dominic's. And Dominic, we actually did have some questions to start with. One is, who do you think should manage such a program, and who should be in the various roles?
That's an interesting question. It's one I get asked quite a lot. Ultimately, there's two parts in answering that. The first part is you do need to get executive ownership of this, and ideally look for your CEO or one of his direct reports to nominate somebody as a program manager. And in my experience, the best program managers are construction managers, because it's what you do every day effectively and very well in your day-to-day business. If you can get a tech-savvy construction manager, you're certainly onto a winner. In terms of the individual roles, again, it very much depends on your corporate culture, but what you're looking for is somebody who is both bullish, who's prepared to run with this, pick up the ball and run with this, but is very good at communicating and managing the disparate needs of a very wide group of individuals, everybody from the HR back office functions to your project delivery functions.
Well, that's great. Thanks. You know, I think this is actually a related question. What if you can't get commitment from the executive team? Do you have any advice for addressing that challenge?
And again, that's one that if we look at how other sectors have overcome that, because certainly, particularly in construction, it can often be quite difficult to fund technology programs. Technology is often seen as an overhead. The key here is, I'll reiterate going back to the beginning, is wherever you can, link to your company's KPIs. If you can demonstrate you can save money at that level through the use of BIM, even if you just demonstrated on one or two pilot projects, do a projection of what this would look like if you scaled that up. If you can help to, for example, a really interesting one is think about what you might be able to do in terms of improving your company's cash flow. If, for example, you're doing 5D BIM, look at scaling that up as a projection and say, well, potentially could this mean we would improve our cash flow? And even in theory, reduce our cost of borrowing if we're able to give a better look ahead to the banks or whoever it is that we're looking at borrowing our money from. So wherever possible, look at linking to corporate KPIs, because that's the language that your C-suite is going to respond to. If you talk in those terms rather than walking in the door and talking in technology terms, the way that I've seen it is that's a far more successful bargaining chip in terms of getting commitment.
Great, thanks. We do have another one that's a slightly different topic. How can the industry tap into the best practices that other industries have from when they've undertaken similar programs?
Yeah. Okay. So again, there's a couple of avenues there. The first is there is an awful lot of information in the public domain now. Everything from getting onto Amazon.com and buying books on business transformation in various sectors, to getting on the web, to there are various. If you look at the various industry associations, perhaps outside of construction. So if, for example, you speak with your CFO about the industry associations for chartered accountants, for professional accountants, etc., that often have great chapters, great subgroups that really focus on these issues, and go along to them and looking at tapping into that best learning. Once you start looking, there are phenomenal amounts there. Those of you that use consultancies, that partner with management consultants, this is their bread and butter, so there's no harm in perhaps opening a dialogue with them, and perhaps even considering getting them in to do some training or some awareness, or helping you to win that battle of what it will take and what a major transformation program would look like.
That's fantastic. Thanks, Dominic. I do have one more for you. I do want to remind folks that if you have questions, please do jump in now and put them in the chat pane, which is, I think, in the lower left-hand corner of your screen. But while anyone else is adding any additional questions, Dominic, last one for you is, in that same vein of building support within the organization and consensus with folks in the organization. So it's how would you recommend engaging with all of the various groups and individuals that will be affected by this type of program?
Yeah, that's a great one. I'd say if you look at how is your organization set up and how does it traditionally communicate major change, regardless of technology and BIM and everything, how does it today manage that effectively? If you think about it, a major program could last anywhere typically between 12 and 36 months, so it's a bit like running a marathon. And the key to this is change affects people and their job roles in different ways, and let's not underestimate here, what you are doing is changing what they are doing. And everybody as human beings likes to feel in charge of their own destiny. So it's a question of working out for the different constituencies that exist, how do you empower them? How do you make them at least feel empowered in their destiny, getting them on board? Partly it's about communication, partly it's about what is it you're going to give them on a regular basis so that they taste success, so that their process improves, they don't have to wait 12 months for it, so that they're getting a win. So that they are sharing in the success, the spoils of what you're doing on a regular basis, as opposed to waiting until everything's over and then being told, isn't this a great thing, and haven't you had a great time?
All right, great. Thank you so much, Dominic.
Okay.
That wraps up the questions that we've received. So with that, I will say thank you for attending again. We appreciate you spending time with us, and we'll conclude the webinar for today.
Excellent. Please, everybody, please be sure to complete that attendance form within the next 2 days of your Seeking Continuing Education credits. Thank you, Dominic. Thank you, Scott. Thanks to everybody who attended, and have a great day.